So our first question, directed to Dr. Anda, is how do you help parents who don't want the help and who are most abusive? Most parents are good at not being known to the system.
Well, you want to answer that?
Go ahead.
Well, I think that's a tough question. I think the first thing is that is the idea of general communication and identification. So if we need to communicate this so people are comfortable talking about it and begin to normalize this discussion in our culture. And the second thing is to do the kind of history taking that's necessary in all the service environments so that these issues don't go unidentified. And then be able to do the kind of trauma-informed teaching and intervention, teaching about parenting, the kind of interventions that David was talking about this morning that they do with the children they deal with. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but it's universal communication, making it this general public health knowledge, and then where there's contact in human service systems, that everyone gets a chance to give this history or to have this history obtained from them so that it doesn't go unidentified and people are comfortable working with it.
So in a sense, really raising awareness of this as a public health issue is a first step broadly so that it kind of becomes normalized and more awareness about it, and seeking help maybe becomes more normalized, and then also it's built into how we do assessments in different systems.
Yes, I think those need to be done simultaneously, and in most of the major public health success stories that I'm aware of in the past few decades, that's the approach that was taken, is public education, provider education, and then bringing the two of them together simultaneously.
Okay.
And I would agree that a significant amount of abuse is unidentified by the system, that it's unknown to us. And when I think about how when I'm working with young clinicians and training them to take histories, I often say that our clients will only go as far as we are comfortable going in those interviews. And if we're not asking the right questions, whether it's collecting it from a survey or asking it in a face-to-face interview, if we're not secure in our ability to answer the question and then follow up and move forward, then how could we ever expect the clients and families that we work with to engage in a dialogue? We have to be the ones to open the door. And I find that generally speaking, when you open the door, clients and families will walk through it. And more often than not, families want to do better. They want to be different. They want to provide their children every opportunity that we all want for ours. And I really think it's a matter of starting the discussion, but being brave enough when we're having those interactions in beginning the conversation.
So developing systems to ask the questions and supporting people on the front lines to know how to ask those questions. Ray, anything that you would like to add?
No, I used to teach remedial reading to kids, and would run into situations where their parents were illiterate. And it was an act of bravery for those family members to give the kids permission to learn how to read. And similarly here, in the health home, one of the points of philosophy that we're articulating and maintaining is that the family is the natural care manager of the child. We don't need a government apparatus to come in and take care of a child's health. In most cases, a family should be doing that. If you have a care manager and you're in a health home, that says something about how well you were doing as a care manager. And if we can't figure out how to negotiate that with brave families, we're going to have difficulty getting in. And I think that it's a great question, and probably one of the most difficult things we have to do. To the extent that I've failed my child at various points in her life, I'm going to have a hard time greeting somebody who's going to help me do better. But in the end, I want to do better. And in the end, if they can make it possible for me to move ahead, then that's area, there's no question about it.
It sounds like some key pieces of what you're talking about is working with the family as a whole, services that really take the whole family into account and support parents, recognize what parents maybe have gone through in their own lives and have struggled with, and support parents in finding ways to continue to do better with their own kids and engage them around that. Great. Well, the next question
I want to reiterate
is...
and
sure.
to make it feel safe. I think what you were referring to, Dave, was having it feel safe to be able to do what you're uncomfortable talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so how do we create that safety within our systems as we're responding to whole families and supporting parents? Yeah, and help them to feel safe. The next question is directed towards David Wallace, and then I'll ask the others to chime in as well. I work in an adult residential mental health program. Individuals get triggered and use maladaptive skills. How do you suggest staff help the other residents who in turn get triggered by that first resident's maladaptive skills?
Starting with the easy questions, huh, Heather?
Well, it's a compliment. You got a hard question right off the bat.
I guess the best way I can answer that is just to share my experience of working in residential care with youth. That the behaviors that our residents can exhibit will be triggering not just to the other residents, but also to staff. And I think it's about creating an environment that promotes safety and trust and healing. And we've been having more and more conversations lately about the impact and the potential for restorative justice processes within the congregate care environment, in which moving away from a response of punishment or consequences or law enforcement engagement, and moving toward the community beginning to address that individual's behavior and supporting one another and creating a more sustainable and safe and protective environment, I think is something that's helpful and has shown some promise in a number of different areas.
So it sounds like you're highlighting intentional development of the community that includes peer support as a part of that. Great. Other comments?
Just that the comments that David made, his description of the staff talking about the basic concepts, then you got the community. And then everything that happens within that community context becomes a learning opportunity for everyone who's in the community. And it's not an if that sort of situation is going to happen. It's going to be continuous. And if your community is prepared and you've enriched the community, the inhabitants of it can understand what's going on a lot better.
So it sounds like it involves that intentional community development involves starting with sharing information, developing a shared language with some key concepts that you can continue to return to, and having a perspective from which you understand what's going on and work to create those peer supports around issues of safety and dealing with triggers.
Yeah, I think it's also part of the process is recognizing that these things are happening, that we are impacted by the behaviors, the actions of others, and if we can continue to be talking about that, rather than just making the assumption that, okay, well, individual A is behaving in such a way that's damaging to themselves and is somehow outside of the expectations of the routine, and that it doesn't have any impact on the others in that unit or dorm or whatever the center is. Again, it's having that conversation, and how has this behavior impacted you, and beginning to debrief in a more meaningful and deeper way. And just talking about, well, is this the environment that we want for one another? And so there's an opportunity to intervene on an individual level, debriefing with individuals that were triggered by someone else's behavior, but also debriefing on a community level. And how do we want to take better care of one another, and creating that momentum toward the self-healing environment, self-healing community that Dr. Anda spoke about earlier, can happen on a microcosm in a dormitory or on a larger macro level in a neighborhood or community or a city.
And so having that language initially and that information helps people to continually return to what's behind the behavior, and knowing that this impacts all of us and that we all have a role to play in some way in ACE response, that we can all help to intentionally develop this restorative, safe context within which we're serving people. Great. The next question is directed towards Ray Schimmer, and then I'll check in with the others of you. How does the trauma of racism on top of ACEs affect the development of a child? I would like to hear how race is a factor in ACE scores, clients, and staff.
First of all, the adverse experience is the adverse experience, and to the extent that racism increases the likelihood that you're going to go through these things, it obviously adds an enormous burden to the child and family going through. I see the effects of racism as to make people more vulnerable physically, but also more vulnerable psychologically. Not to know when you're for sure whether you're being discriminated against or whether you're not to know if you're being hurt because of your race or because of an accident. These are hard things to carry. Again, as I said in my talk, I think that and I was, to the extent that I was upset when I first began to study ACEs and hear people, it was about that question of predestination. What can we, after it's happened, how can you get out of it? And then when we look at root causes, if we're looking at a mosquito, we're looking at an adverse experience. And the answer is to not let those things happen. I think when folks are victims of racism, they're much more likely to have to deal with more episodes of adverse experience, and that, in my mind, that would be the real danger.
So while ACEs typically take place within family settings, you're also pointing out that there are these societal issues impacting on families and other resources that co-arise with ACEs that some people have and other people do not have. And so there's supports and a lack of supports that play a role in how ACEs play out in people's lives. And it sounds like you might also be starting to point to the issue of some larger societal concerns also potentially being ACEs as well.
Absolutely, mm-hmm. And that's what I was getting at before, talking about enlarging maybe the roster of adverse experiences. Mm-hmm. The ones that we're talking about right now are largely personal and interpersonal. Mm-hmm. The impact of the larger environment on people growing up with it is undeniable. Again, you're going to have resistance for all those reasons that we talked about earlier, but it's something that we need to get into.
So racism may make people more vulnerable to ACEs, and it may also be another ACE category, perhaps. Absolutely. Other comments?
Well, and I would add to the complicating or compounding factor that racism presents. I think poverty, gender, sexual orientation. I think these things are factors that make it more challenging and potentially pose barriers to resources and mm-hmm. things that perhaps many of us take for granted as opportunities for recovery and health and wellness. And I think one of the powerful things about the CDC study is that there was a pretty strong link between high ACE scores and serious long-term health consequences for a relatively affluent, middle-class, Caucasian population with a lot of education resources and health insurance, good insurance. And those scores led to some serious consequences. And so if we think about the impact or compounding factors of race, poverty, gender, and a variety of other factors as being things that may get in the way of access to appropriate services and supports, then I think it becomes a very complex but serious issue to be paying attention to.
So really plugging what we know about ACEs into a larger context and appreciating the role of culture and systems and how we respond or don't respond to ACEs, or how we might add more risks to people's lives. Yeah. Dr. Anza?
In Philadelphia, there's a group that did Philadelphia ACE Urban Survey that deals with some of these issues. I don't know if that's been published yet. You might try Googling the Philadelphia Urban ACE Survey, but they asked people in that community, predominantly African-American community, about experiences of racism, of feeling as though you're unsafe, like going to school, going to the store, being bullied, being robbed, witnessing violence in the community. other factors relating to things that generate fear and a sense of unsafety in the community-wide environment. So the idea of ACEs is being expanded. Several years ago, I worked with the World Health Organization with a number of researchers from around the world who came to hear about the basic concept of ACEs, which when Dr. Filetti and I developed it was sort of based on this sort of family household constellation of experiences, and they brought up things that would be relevant in other countries like forced marriage, being held prisoner, having someone abducted from your family, torture, living in a war zone. So there obviously are other stressors or ACEs that can be included.
And those things are bad too.
Yeah. I think just one note of caution is we need to be careful not to make the list so expansive and exhaustive that we can't keep track of them, and that we try to concentrate on adversities for which we have a will to change or things that are actually changeable. And I'm not saying any of those things aren't, but that was another one of the premises that we used when we developed the study, that there was an ability to do something about some of these experiences, and there was a will in one place or another around the country. There was funding or agencies that were actually trying to work on some of those experiences.
So more attention to community violence and also thinking about how policies can impact on those issues and how systems can respond to those issues too.
And if I might, I'm adding this, maybe I'm asking my own question, but the other thing that I've learned about that I didn't really understand when I began on this journey is the issue of historical trauma, which is something that is really painful to think about for those cultures that have experienced historical trauma, and how do we take these macro scale historic incidents that may have occurred several generations prior that are still influencing the health of certain populations, and integrate and acknowledge that history that's been passed on into what's going on in this sort of community and then household family constellation of adversities. And that may sound really complicated. I think it is. But I would add that to things that we need to think about. How do we deal with the healing of historical trauma?
So not just thinking about how do we expand the ACE categories, but how do we handle a complex issue and take more steps in terms of healing from a larger societal perspective as well.
Yes. No, a gentleman down here this morning. Do you want to come up on the panel? Just for a minute. I think this is a really important issue, and I don't want to create. I don't want to create fear, but one of the things that I believe, and this is again, I have to be careful of what I believe and what the science shows, is that the intergenerational transmission of adversity is through experience, but there's also evidence that there's intergenerational transmission of adversity through epigenetic mechanisms. There's a number of studies, for example, of what happened, health outcomes related to the fire bombings of London, and health outcomes for, yeah.
I'm a student of history, one of my interests, and I was reading a book that I would recommend called, I believe it's Savage History. It's the history of Europe post-World War II. And a little known fact that I knew about was that when the Russians had occupied Germany, there were about 1.2 million women who were raped by the Russians. And this is a little known fact that we know of. And now I've been doing some reading that there are physicians and therapists in Germany who are helping these women to uncover the trauma that they experienced. And most of these women, after this experience, when their husbands came home from prisoner of war camps, just encapsulated that experience. So here we have, theoretically, a generation of German women who would be my mother's age, and I think many of our mother's age, who were potentially viciously raped by Russian soldiers who had experienced their own trauma when the Germans had during the war. And now therapists are just beginning to touch the surface of these folks in their elderly years. And that's just one incidence. If we think of the experience of Native Americans in America, where there was a genocide in the 1800s, and the experience of that, or the long-lasting vestiges of slavery. I mean, we're talking about a historical component where populations were brutalized. And how does that translate to the group as a whole? And how does it affect family relationships, parental relationships, trust? I mean, we call that rippling, the ripples of all these experiences. And I think we as clinicians and therapists and working with folks who have intergenerational experiences of trauma, we're like, as I was saying, we're like on the end of the whip that gets whipped around. And we might not even be knowing what these people carry with them, consciously, unconsciously, or genetically, and so forth. But I think, as I was talking to Dr. Andis today, I think a next step would be with historians. There's a lot of historians now who are looking at these mass traumatic experiences that have occurred historically throughout humankind. Where's the intersection there, and where does that affect? I just think that's a very interesting component. Let me go back and stay up here. I like it. I like playing the big guys.
So really speaking to the important issue of paying more attention to community violence on a much larger scale and healing on a much larger scale. The next question, directed to Rob Anda. On many of the graphs that you showed, the upward progression of negative effect clips back down around 3 ACEs before going up again at higher scores. Any ideas of what that might be attributed to?
You know, that's interesting. I get asked, some people really look closely at those graphs, don't they?
That's the problem with making them.
Yeah. I'm going to have to smooth those out. No, I actually don't know. That is something that's been brought up from time to time. It's not consistent, throughout everything that we do, but it is fairly frequent. And the answer is I don't really know why that happens. There may be a constellation of 3 different ACEs that tend to co-occur more frequently than other that may have actually less effect in terms of stress than others. But I honestly don't know, and it would take probably a fairly intensive, multivariate statistical years of research to be able to sort that out. I think the thing when you do look at those graphs as an epidemiologist, what I do is I don't look at the differences. I look at the general consistencies of the trend, and that they generally go in an upward direction from one score to the next, and that's a consistent phenomenon.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment at all? Got plenty of other questions too. Okay, the next question for David Wallace. Do you believe that people exposed to abuse in childhood seek out abusive relationships because it's familiar? And then in parentheses it says, as uncomfortable as the abuse is, they feel they can cope versus the discomfort they feel with facing the unfamiliar territory of healthy relationships and coping mechanisms.
You did start with the easy questions, didn't you? They are getting harder. I think there are many clinicians in the room, including myself, that work quite a bit with individuals who've been sexually abused and physically abused, and I think anecdotally it is the experience of our field that we find that children who have been physically and sexually abused often get into abusive relationships. And I think there are many mechanisms for that. I think it has a lot to do with their perception of themselves, their self-worth, their self-esteem. I think it has to do with when I talked about the relationship between adrenaline, cortisol, dopamine, serotonin, that even destructive and unhealthy relationships feel good. and oftentimes working with children who have been sexually abused, the sexual experiences are in and of themselves not hurtful and damaging, and often that can feel good and gets very confusing. And so I think there's lots of different layers to that question, but I think the short answer is yes, that I think the field anecdotally experiences that. I don't think we completely understand the mechanisms for that.
Another part of the question that I didn't read before, just to make it a little more challenging for you, how do you best show a client this pattern?
I think it always goes back to conversation and helping them to explore and examine whether or not those relationships are in fact working for them, and are those the experiences that they do want, and helping them expect and understand that they are capable and worth safer and more healthy and more productive relationships. And I think generally speaking, not unlike my response to the question earlier about parents wanting more and better opportunities for their children, I think all of the clients that we work with want more and better opportunities for improved relationships. And I think through a process of discussion and exploration and therapy and sequential steps toward making better choices and being and being in different relationships and building on success is really how you get there.
So finding ways to support people and moving beyond what's familiar towards new opportunities for healthier relationships. Other comments?
Change is scary.
Yeah, change. Mm-hmm. Please talk about the importance of working with prenatal mothers, parents, and parents of young children.
Yeah, I feel passionately about that. The well-supported family, my hypothesis is, the well-supported family can protect children under normal circumstances from many adverse experiences. The well-supported family, meaning that the community helps the family do that protecting. I've had a chance to serve on boards at private schools, worked as I did at Northern Rivers for so long, and the amount of support that families get varies enormously. If we get back to the question of racism, families that may be racially discriminated against are not getting a lot of support for the community. But when they do, they form a shield over the child that protects them from those adverse experiences. And the best way to respond to traumatic to experiences that generate pathogens is not to let them happen in the first place, to prevent them. And I think the families are best situated to do that. I would be sure, whether a family chooses to use it or not, that every family, irrespective of circumstances, had access to support in the community, the way that my family did and the way that many families do. If you can stop, it's much more effective to stop it from happening than it is to fix it after it's happened. I know that's simplistic, but I think it's fairly sound.
So the whole community has a role to play in preventing adverse childhood experiences and their consequences, and that as a community we need to look at how do we make sure that we provide adequate supports for everybody in the community.
If mom's got to go to work because she has to earn money, we have to make sure that where the child is a safe place. Mm-hmm. And we have to do that with her, not take that responsibility away from her, but help her execute it herself. If there's not support for behavioral health problems within the family, then we have to get that help. But whatever we can do to prevent the adverse experience from happening, to reduce them in number, frequency, and intensity, I think is where we're going to be at in the end. We'll have great respect for the sophisticated and elaborate remedial techniques that require high intelligence and personal discipline, and those would be great. But it's hard to do. It's much better to prevent the thing from happening and to prevent the chain of pathogenic circumstances from developing.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
I think what you were saying, Ray, and the question makes me think of one way of defining success that I hadn't really thought about clearly until recently is success is preventing the progression. So a success can be defined as you may not have prevented the first or the second adversity, but you can prevent the score from going from 2 to 3, or from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. In prevention, it's hard to know when you prevented something, but having somebody stop at 4 and not getting to 6 or 8 is success, even though you started at 2.
Sure.
Right? Because in these constellations of communities and families, there is a tendency for there to be a lot of sources of adversity, and I think so that we can not get discouraged, that I think the real goal is to slow down the progression, and that from one generation to the next, if we can have the average score be a little bit lower in 10 or 20 years than it is today, that's how we define success. And if we try to say that we're just going to knock all of these pathogens, have some super antibiotic that knocks all these pathogens out in a really short period of time, that we're going to get worn out and we're going to be criticized if we set the bar that high.
Sure. People are still getting malaria too, so.
Yeah.
So to Rob Anda, wouldn't a formal class in grade school, like ACEs 101 and brain development, be more helpful in life than some other science classes? If so, how could we begin this education transformation?
Boy, I'm going to be really careful about teaching elementary school and what should be in the curriculum and what shouldn't be. I think I don't know about age-appropriate teaching, first of all, because I'm not a teacher and I'm not all that versed in what's age-appropriate developmentally. But one of my beliefs is that before kids graduate from high school, they ought to be exposed to the kind of concepts and everything that we've learned here today. I think it's safe to say that teenagers can probably safely understand this stuff and the concepts that are they far enough along to really understand all this? I think the answer is yes. And that they ought to learn about some basic ideas about child development and some basic concepts of parenting and to understand something about sequential neurodevelopment, how children develop, why children are vulnerable the way they are and the way we discussed today. Because I know for me as a parent, doing this research changed the way I parented my children. And it was a little too late for them. They were a little too young. I learned this after they were really little kids, but I caught myself doing things that would have stressed my kids and that I just go, why would I be doing that? So I think the understanding the basic concept that stress can have a lasting negative effect on your child's life trajectory is something that everybody should understand and should be taught universally.
And I would agree that while there's probably some value in having children be exposed to this information, I think part of what we understand, because of what we understand about child development, is that younger children, even adolescents, again, don't have that consequential thinking and tend to think of themselves as being pretty invincible. As a youth myself, I understood and I was told frequently that smoking really is not good for you at all. In fact, it can kill you. And as I shared before, I used to smoke. And so, I think it's easy for children to somehow see themselves as exceptions to the rule. And so I wonder if maybe the bigger impact is getting this information, the data, and the skills into the hands of educators, into the hands of parents, into the hands of social workers and pediatricians, and the folks that really can be working more collaboratively to reduce the likelihood that children will end up on this pathway.
And this is sort of radical, I guess. I can afford to be radical. I'm flying back to Atlanta. There's so many things that are emphasized in terms of the testing standards for kids in our schools, but what about some of these social skills and relational skills and the things we've talked about today as being something that could be put as part of the standardized curricula there'd be test scores and say that success is understanding, attachment and what a healthy relationship is like, and some of the major components of the concepts that we've talked about today. And like I said, I think it's really fundamental information that everybody should understand.
Thank you. Ray, did you want to add anything?
No.
Okay.
I have no informed opinion on this.
The next question is to David Wallace. How do you analyze motivators and determine the relationship between ACE score and motivator manipulation, parentheses, besides flight, fright, and freeze? Please share one intervention that could impact behavior motivation.
I think it starts with a fundamental understanding of first of all, do they identify a problem? And their perspective of the problem may not be the same perspective that we have as adults or caregivers. And so, can we start? I think it's core social work values and studying where our clients are at, understanding the problem from the perspective of the child, and helping them to determine whether or not they would like to be doing something differently. And for me, this kind of comes back to roots of motivational interviewing and understanding stages of change and how people move through that process, and being able to help them explore the pros and cons of staying put where they're at versus the pros and cons of making a shift and making that change, which is always difficult and comes with risks and loss potentially. And to always be toggling back and forth between whether or not there's an advantage to them in making that shift, and what are they realistically walking away from, and validating that moving away from that potentially damaging behavior or relationship does come with a legitimate loss, and being able to talk about that openly and honestly, I think is part of that process. And then who reinforces those behaviors? Well, I think that can come from external means. We can certainly reinforce and reward pro-social and positive behaviors, token economies, PBIS, things like that. But I think if we're having more of that involved conversation with our clients, the reward is more of an internal process, that they've set a goal and they've made steps and made some shifts and made some changes. And I think those changes, provided we're building on small successes and then growing and growing and growing, I think those are more internally driven rather than externally driven, which I think probably leads in promotes lasting change more effectively than those external rewards.
So it sounds like, again, talking about the process of change, and you're speaking to both the internal motivation and then the external community supports that can move that forward and help people to experience those successes that come out of their own motivation. Other comments? Okay. The next question, actually, I got a new question that very much relates to the next question to Ray, so I'll read both of them. Are there any studies on people who have a high-level ACE score but low-level symptoms, specific correlations, i.e. mentors, faith community, etc.? And then the related question is, how do you explain people who have high ACE scores and do not have the consequences?
Okay, I don't know of any studies. I do know that you get individual reactions to sort of any disease state. I keep going back to this malaria thing because I think in many respects it's a very good, very useful as an example. There were people who worked in the swamps in the Panama Canal for 5 years, and maybe they had a cold one day, but otherwise everything was fine. And there were people who were dead 24 hours after they got there. The differential apparatus that people have for resistance is pretty amazing. So I'm not surprised. I don't know why. When we talk about research, I hope we will know why someday. A much grosser example, but taking a look at post-traumatic stress disorder of some soldiers, people going through the same situations and emerging and having completely different life life paths. Some people permanently disabled, it's effectively the end of their life, and other people using it as a source of, apparently using it as a source of strength and carrying on. So I think this is a scientific question that we don't know the answer to. I would hardly expect a 100% identical reaction from human beings to any external intrusion.
So again, I think you're making the point that ACEs co-arise with a whole range of inner and outer resources in people's lives, and that helps to explain why some people with high ACE scores might not have those serious consequences necessarily, because perhaps they have other inner and outer resources to draw on. The other thing I'll add, just related...
Can I make a...
Oh,
I'd
sure,
like to say
please,
something about that. This is a question that comes up fairly frequently, and I think that we need to take some care in looking at people that have a lot of ACEs and saying that they don't have consequences. The question asked is, which consequences are you looking for? Or which ones didn't you look for? In the ACE study, we have one publication where we took a variety of 18 different health and social problems, and we scored those, if I can try to explain this, from 0 to 18. Okay, so you could have none of those problems or all 18 of those variety of health and social problems. And as the score goes up, the number of co-occurring problems that people have goes up in a stepwise fashion. So for like an ACE score of 6 or 7, most people averaged about 5 or 6 co-occurring problems. So we have to be careful about defining lack of effect based upon looking at a couple of simple types of outcomes. And I think probably Ray, what you referred to, there's going to be natural human or biologic variability in the susceptibility to all those variety of outcomes that are dependent upon whether it affects your brain or some other tissue in your body, how much you react to stress. And the resilience literature, I think, is relatively new, because I think this is beginning to talk about the idea of resilience. Many of the studies that I've read that talk about resilience factors tend to look at 1 or 2 single kinds of outcomes occurring or not occurring in the presence of adversity when one person has a protective or resilience factor and another doesn't, and calling a person, defining a resilience factor as the absence of 1 or 2 outcomes. Is that making sense? We need to say what are the variety of outcomes that can occur across the lifespan before we say that someone has not been affected. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that some people can't have a lot of adversity and be unaffected or relatively unaffected. But we need to be careful about oversimplifying that.
Good points, that actually there are many outcomes to potentially look at. And then also it could be that certain things our society might inadvertently supports. For example, if somebody became a workaholic to
Yes.
became apparently successful
Yes.
when they're trying to cope with a high ACE score as
Yes.
well. Too. Yeah, really important points. David, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, thanks.
Okay. And I'll mention too that in terms of the research, while there may not be research, ACE-specific research on some of these issues, I think there's an opportunity to start to integrate our resilience and recovery research with the ACE research, and then use that to inform some of those next steps, and looking broadly at all of those outcomes as well.
Yeah, the exciting thing here is that 10 years from now, we may have an answer to that, an answer to more questions. The research has got to continue on.
Yeah, good.
And we're not at the end state right now. We're just learning. This is pretty interesting.
Well, there are a number of questions more. We're near the end, so maybe this is a chance for some final comments. It is a chance for final comments. At the last 5 minutes.
I for one, am impressed by the work and that all of you do. The questions that you've asked were very hard. And I think that I think that's reflective of the level at which each of you are really processing this information and pushing further, which is really exactly what I had hoped that all of you would walk away with, was a sense of not just what we're beginning to understand, but more of a motivation and drive to go out and start asking more questions. And I'm impressed, and I'm very optimistic about the direction that we're all headed, and if these are the questions that folks out there are asking.
And I would like to encourage you to do two things, is to think about, as you leave here, somebody somewhere in a system that you don't work in that you want to reach out to tomorrow and talk about this about, to try to foster cross-systems kind of work, and that this is something that, we're not experts. You're the experts, and when I go to communities and they ask me for the answer, I say, I don't know the answer. You know the answer. I encourage you to go out and innovate and to try new ways of doing things in the system you work, because that's what I see popping around the country is people that take this information, go back to their school, go back to wherever they work, and try something different, and then new changes emerge that work, and then people will watch that and pass the word about what you did here that worked, and not wait for somebody else to do it for you.
I would just say, please. I retired last year, and when you do that, you think about your career, and there were kind of three big ideas in my career that changed the way that I approached the work permanently. The first one was when I was quite young, and I learned about behavior modification, and found it fascinating, and found that it answered so many questions I had. The second one that Dr. Anda touched on a couple times here, and you all read your Anna Freud, is attachment and separation, a hugely important aspect of human growth and development. And then we come to ACEs theory, and the help that gave when you were sitting on the floor bleeding from a bite wound, and all you did was ask the kid to brush his teeth. How did I get here? Got a better idea of how we got here. So I again want to personally thank both David and Dr. Andra and Bill Wolf and LaSalle for the opportunity to be here today and to celebrate the progress that we've made in this area over the years.